Many of them offer you a chance to purchase something and then pay back in 4 equal installments with no interest. So a lot of people think they are a terrific means to access products and services that they otherwise might not be able to afford in the immediate term. But as we're also hearing, there are concerns about not knowing enough regarding the industry. So we're going to talk about all of that, much more when we come back. This is On Point.
Stick around for more of On Point on KUOW 94.9 Seattle. It's 11:39. Sunny and warm in Seattle, 73 degrees now, expecting a high of at least 83 today. Tomorrow, sunny again with a high of 81.
Support for KUOW comes from Seattle Theater Group, presenting Paul Giamatti at Seattle's Town Hall, Friday, May 17th, for a live recording of his podcast, Chinwag, with philosopher Stephen Asma. More info and tickets available at stgpresents.org and townhallseattle.org.
Hi, it's Bill Radke. Seattle might close 20 public elementary schools.
I'm convinced that bringing us to a smaller footprint is going to allow us to do more things.
Some parents are not convinced. We'll discuss that and the rest of the week's news on Week in Review, today at noon on KUOW 94.9, Seattle's NPR news station. Subscribe to the Week in Review podcast.
Support for KUOW comes from the Bellingham Farmers Market, supporting agriculture with farmers, artisans, and other producers from Whatcom and Skagit counties. This 100-stall market is 90 minutes north of the Seattle metro region. Open Saturdays from 10 to 2. Info at bellinghamfarmersmarket.org.
Support for On Point comes from BetterHelp, committed to supporting mental health through therapy and helping clients find balance. Clients are matched with one of 35,000 therapists for online therapy from anywhere at betterhelp.com/public. And Angie, dedicated to helping homeowners find skilled pros to get their home projects done well, from everyday repairs to dream remodels. Reviews, pricing, and booking are at Angie.com or on the Angie app.
You're back with On Point. I'm Meghna Chakrabarty. And by the way, since today is Friday, it's the day we drop the jackpot into the On Point podcast feed. And that is, of course, our weekly conversation with On Point news analyst Jack Beatty. And he brings together history and politics and literature in a way that really makes us think more provocatively about the world we live in now. And this week, in the Jackpod, Jack talks about America's long history of illiberalism. Really interesting conversation. So subscribe to the On Point podcast and take a listen to this week's Jackpod. Today we're talking about buy now, pay later loans, and I'm joined by Penny Lee, Jennifer Chen, and Tim Quinlan. And Tim, I just wanted to turn to you what Penny had said before the break, that she said approximately 80% of these loans are bank-issued loans, and so therefore they are regulated, and so perhaps maybe it's not as much of a phantom service as we had been previously discussing. Your response?
I have no beef with the idea that 80% of the loans are regulated. The buy now pay later providers themselves have, all of their funding is vetted and clarified. What I worry about is since the accounts are not since the accounts are not reported to credit reporting agencies, consumers who pay on those accounts as agreed don't benefit from their positive performance. And regulators have reasonable concern that consumers may be carrying debt that's not visible to other financial service companies, including, for what it's worth, other buy now, pay later lenders. So in the event that the consumer has a problem with payment, there's risk that the consumer will experience negative credit consequences, kind of as Jessica did in the introduction of your segment. So it's not that the firms themselves aren't regulated, it's that we don't have any delineation about the composition of credit transaction volumes, who's carrying the debt, what their payment history is on it. And those are the kind of metrics that are widely available in, for example, consumer credit card lending. So I think that would be my response.
Yeah. So Penny, this is actually exactly something I wanted to ask you, because the buy now, pay later loans, I mean, lenders, they happily report to the credit bureaus when payments are missed or late. Why not also do the opposite? Why not report when those 4 payments are made on time and responsibly?
That's actually not true. I know, I can speak to the members in which we represent. And so I would say, of the 5 largest buy now, pay later, they actually don't report when it's negative, when somebody misses a payment, or when it's positive. Unfortunately, we have been in active conversations with the credit bureaus to try to have them modernize their own modeling. Right now, even Experian recently has entered into an agreement with Apple Pay Later. Even in their own FAQs, they said, as of today, scoring models that exist aren't designed with BNPL in mind, but they may in the future as new credit scored models are developed. So right now, unfortunately, the reporting agencies don't have the ability to be able to capture real-time BNPL information in a way that wouldn't harm them. When you take out a buy now, pay later loan right now, and you have multiple ones, it looks like you've maxed out your credit for each one of them. And because of that, it would score you negatively. What we believe, and agree with Tim, agree with Jennifer, is that somebody repaying every 2 weeks $25 consistently, on time, responsibly, that should go to positive credit history. Unfortunately, the modeling isn't there, but we are in active conversations. We're in earnest conversations with the bureaus and other private sector potential solutions to be able to get this modeling correct, because we do believe that this is a product that should bode positively for your credit score.
Okay, all 3 of you, you can imagine my confusion right now. Because I'm hearing they don't report positive repayment and only report negative repayment to the credit bureaus. Penny's saying nothing is reported from her clients either way. I need to understand what is the truth here? How do we best understand the truth? Jennifer, I'm going to give you the first crack at that.
Please, I can chime in. I would just circle back to what I said before. It's not well defined what the boundaries of this market are. As Penny said, she has 5 buy now, pay later, and the traditional pay in 4 buy now, pay later companies in her association. There's other buy now, pay later, pay in 4 as well. There's buy now, pay later beyond that. So for example, at Consumer Reports, we conducted an evaluation of a range of buy now, pay later companies, and we found that there is a mix of practices with respect to credit reporting, and quite a wide range. Some buy now, pay later companies did not report any information, as Penny said. Some reported positive and negative information just to one of the credit bureaus. One reported just negative information, as Tim alluded to. So it's another instance of inconsistency in the market, partly because it's not fully regulated from a consumer credit perspective, and our concern is from a consumer protection perspective. So there is not a consistent approach towards reporting information to the credit bureaus. And as Penny said, it's critical to consider that there isn't an adapted approach yet within credit bureaus to consider how to treat this information so that it doesn't harm consumers' credit scores.
This seems to happen frequently in fintech, right? That new products are created, and great innovation in finance. It's wonderful. But at the same time, there's a catch-up game that has to be played by federal regulators and, also, as you're saying, even the credit bureaus, to be sure that the new products don't sort of metastasize into something that ends up not just harming consumers, but the entire economy. Hello, 2008, right? So where would you start in terms of, Jennifer, in terms of like trying to perhaps even first principles, like get some definitions for what regulators actually consider as buy now, pay later?
So I would say from a consumer advocacy perspective and from Consumer Reports, we think there should be regulation of buy now, pay later as credit because it is essentially like a credit product, but in a reasonable and proportionate manner. And this is the approach that's been taken in Australia, in the UK, applying the existing credit framework, the consumer credit framework, but having some adaptations for the unique characteristics of buy now, pay later, which is essentially deferring payment on it's essentially credit. So if you put in place some of the core provisions of existing financial consumer protection regulation and laws related to credit, you would address some of these issues about reporting to credit bureaus, applying chargeback rights to buy now, pay later, which would help resolve some of the issues with disputes, ensuring that there's clear disclosure of any costs and the risks you might incur. And for us in particular, having some sort of reasonable lending practices in place to ensure that buy now, pay later companies, they assess the ability to repay. There's other practices you can promote, like limiting loan stacking or taking out multiple buy now, pay later loans. All of these would be beneficial to have in place to try to address the risks that come with buy now and pay later, so you can use it safely.
So Tim Quinlan, I got to be in my bonnet about something about this, and that is, both you and Jennifer very clearly laid out there are risks here, right? Like you can lose track of payments, you can perhaps not even know that things are due, you can rack up a lot of these, paying for or whatnot. And that, as both of you said, oftentimes the buy now, pay later, like other financial products, are targeted towards lower income and minority communities who are already disproportionately sort of dinged when it comes to credit scores on multiple things. All of that is true. But at the same time, what about personal responsibility? I mean, we're asking people to keep track of 4 payments on a low dollar value. And if they are willing to buy something now, I'm not saying like, okay, take the 10 hours to read all of the fine print, but at least I don't think it's unreasonable to expect people to keep track of money that they're spending, even if they have to make 4 payments in advance. I mean, the risk, they are taking on a risk, and so therefore they have to bear the cost of that risk.
Sure. Listen, the original buy now, pay later was layaway, right? And
yeah, exactly.
And the personal responsibility piece was you didn't get the thing that you wanted to buy until you made all of your payments. And there is an element to be attributed to personal responsibility in this. And I don't think that there's anything about what we've said so far that's at odds with that. But I'll give a kind of a different example. There have been instances where I've wanted to watch a specific football game this year, and I've had to download some different subscription service that I didn't have. And sometimes you're watching it through one platform and a different TV uses another platform. And I eventually look at my credit card statement and realize I've been paying for the same subscription service on 2 different platforms, and I want to kick myself for it. And yeah, I mean, there's a degree of personal responsibility that's attributable there. But when you reduce the friction for a lot of these transactions and provide that convenience that consumers like so well, it can add up to a little bit of lack of transparency. And I don't think there's malicious intent on the part of any of these providers. They're giving consumers what they want and giving them something that's easy and frictionless and convenient. But I hear you. It is up to the individuals, but I can attest that I consider myself pretty fiscally responsible, and I've made some basic mistakes with some of this stuff, and that's why I don't trust myself to pile on a bunch of these PNPL options.
Tim, you work at a bank. I'm upset to hear this. I would expect someone who works at a major financial firm to be like, nope, I've got my spreadsheet. It's always going. But Penny Lee, let me turn the opposite side of that question to you, because look, we have ample history of low income and minority communities who already have a much more fragile financial life being the targets of these kinds of new, more or less unregulated products. And I can understand the great advantage of the digital world allowing, 1 billion transactions to go through, and Klarna and Afterpay and whatnot, they're making, even if they're making like a fraction of a penny on each transaction from the vendors, they're making a ton of money. But the digital world also allows that very, very fine targeting of services to people. And I mean, can you say that your companies are not targeting low-income minority communities who are, perhaps more vulnerable, while also because they can't get regular kinds of credit?
I think what the New York Times, what the New York Fed study also showed was that you're seeing individuals from all different kinds of income brackets using this product. And why are they using it? Because it's giving them price certainty. They know that if they're paying this in full on time, they're incurring no other fees. And so it gives them price certainty. It gives them flexibility. It allows them to be able to fit their own budget needs or their own pay cycles. So that is really important. And I also think another thing to really emphasize is that, and this is publicly available data, many of these companies are public, especially some of the large firms are publicly traded companies, and so they publish. Right now, the industry on average is seeing a less than 2% delinquency rates. And so many of the people, fast, 98% are paying for buy now, pay later, through buy now, pay later products on time, regularly, and consistently. And so I don't want us to be looking and searching for a problem that might not be there when you have a less than 2% delinquency rate on this, folks. Financial Health Network also put out a survey, and they said 99% of BNPL users understood the terms and conditions. They know what they are using, and they're using it responsibly. We're seeing that consistently, and we're seeing those numbers over time. I've seen them come down to now. Some members are even seeing it at less than 1% on a delinquency rate. So we want to make sure we have this all in context.
Well, Tim, I'm going to give you the last word here today. We've got about a minute left. Jennifer went through quite a good list of changes she thinks can be made in the short term. Would you add anything to that? I mean, what would you like to see change so that there is better definitions and a clearer data on exactly what's flowing through the buy now, pay later industry?
Yeah, I think, first of all, I don't assign any positive or negative characteristics to any of the transactions that are going on in the space. All I want is clear disclosure in terms of what the lending looks like, what the transaction volume looks like, and I just want to be able to compare it to other categories. I want to look at it concurrent with credit card debt growth and growth in home equity lines of credit, mortgage debt, because I see evidence of consumers that are in many other categories in debt up to their eyeballs, and this could be something that's adding to it. And when I can't see it, I don't feel good about it. So I'd just like to have more disclosure on the transaction activity and the lending. And I don't think, since we do that for every other category of credit in the United States, and especially if people are doing this and saying, let the air in, we're not doing anything wrong, then just show the data, and I'd feel a lot better about it.
Well, Tim Quinlan, senior economist at Wells Fargo, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
And Jennifer Chen, senior policy counsel at the Financial Fairness Team at Consumer Reports, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
And Penny Lee, president and CEO of the Financial Technology Association. Penny Lee, thank you for being with us.
Magna, thank you.
Well, before we wrap up today, I have a heavy heart, because we're at On Point having to say goodbye to 3 of our staff members, Daniel Ackerman, James Ross, and Steph Katsonis. And particularly to James and Steph. James has been our technical director, and Steph has been our senior producer. I have had the privilege of working with both of them for a couple of decades now. And Steph, I'm going to call you our optimistic bulldog. And I'm going to miss that bulldoggedness in your deep experience in foreign correspondence from your earlier career and your welcoming heart that go along with that incisive, never let go until you get the right guest, producer drive. And James Ross has been with On Point from literally the beginning of this program, more than 20 years. He is the most talented engineer in our building, I would say even in our business. And it was from him that I learned absolutely everything I know about the craft of audio. Our show would not exist without him. Also, he's Scottish, so I'm going to miss our Scottish engineer. To all of you, it has been our privilege to work with you, to make great radio and great journalism with you, and we will miss you every day. live long, and prosper. I'm Meghna Chakrabarty. This is On Point.
On Point is a production of WBUR Boston and is distributed by APM, American Public Media.
Support for On Point comes from Boston University's Questrom School of Business, presenting the Is Business Broken podcast, conversations about the role of business, stakeholder relations, and government at bu.edu/Questrom or wherever podcasts are available. And MathWorks, creators of MATLAB and Simulink software for technical computing and model-based design. MathWorks, accelerating the pace of discovery in engineering and science. Learn more at mathworks.com.
This is KUOW-FM Seattle, KUOW Tumwater, KQOW Bellingham. It's nearly noon and it's Friday, so that means it's almost time for KUOW's Week in Review, hosted by this guy, Bill Radke.
I'm sitting here. You can't see them, but I'm sitting with my guests, the panelists here. We're chit-chatting. We're ready to go. But what happens when the gun goes off? When I don't know what happens at a horse race. The gates open. We're going to talk about which public elementary schools might Seattle close, and will the state make Seattle densify more than the mayor would like, and what's new in the saga of the King County asylum seekers, and what good would a new Seattle opioid recovery center do? And we'll discuss what made us smile this week. My answer involves a swimming BBC reporter and a mountain of sand.
I'll be staying tuned for that.
Please, I would like that. I would like all of you listening to me to stay tuned.
Support for KUOW comes from Valentine Roofing, a full-service roofing company with the ability to help diagnose and resolve roofing issues, ranging from a full replacement to repairs and cleanings, with a reminder for homeowners to get 3 bids for any home improvement project. Learn more at valentineroof.com.
Seattle in the 90s. A tidal wave of iconic music roars out of this sleepy city and takes over pop culture. But here's a story you haven't heard. Let the Kids Dance is a new podcast about the rise and fall of Seattle's teen dance ordinance, a law that made it illegal for young people to go to concerts. It's an untold story about moral panic, grassroots activism, and an unstoppable music community that fought for its freedom. Listen to Let the Kids Dance wherever you get your podcasts.
Support for KUOW comes from UW Medicine, celebrating Nurses Week by thanking nurses for all they do to support UW Medicine's mission to improve the health of the public every day. More at uwmedicine.org. UW Medicine, a higher degree of healthcare.
It is sunny and 74 degrees in Seattle. Going to stay sunny this afternoon. We should get up to about 83. Tonight, a clear sky with a low in the mid-50s. Saturday, sunny, high of 81. Sunday, sunny with a high of 71.
Live from NPR News in Washington, I'm Lakshmi Singh. The United Nations General Assembly is expressing support for Palestinian statehood, though the resolution, approved by 143 nations, does not explicitly mean full UN membership. Palestinian observer Riyad Mansour addressed the body today about the war in Gaza.
Everything has been destroyed. No words can capture what such loss and trauma signifies for Palestinians.
But Israeli Ambassador Gilad Erdan expressed disbelief 7 months after the Hamas attack on Israel that led to the war in Gaza.
With sick and twisted irony, the very body established to prevent evil is now welcoming a terror state into its ranks.
Israel and the U.S. were among 9 nations to vote against the resolution. 25 abstained. A federal appeals court has upheld Steve Bannon's conviction for criminal contempt of Congress. NPR's Ryan Lucas reports the one-time advisor to former President Donald Trump was found guilty of defying a subpoena from the House committee that was investigating the January 6, 2021 attack on the U.S. Capitol.
Steve Bannon was convicted of contempt of Congress and sentenced to 4 months in prison for refusing to provide documents or testimony in response to a subpoena from the House January 6th committee. He appealed, and now a 3-judge panel on the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals has ruled against him. The judges rejected Bannon's argument that he was not guilty because his attorney advised him not to respond to the subpoena. In its ruling, the panel says Bannon's advice of counsel defense is no defense at all. Bannon can still appeal to the Supreme Court, but it declined to take up a similar bid by Peter Navarro, another former Trump advisor who is convicted of the same contempt charges. Ryan Lucas, NPR News, Washington.
Americans are feeling gloomier about the economy now than they were a month ago. NPR's Scott Horsley reports on the latest survey results from the University of Michigan.
The university's index of consumer sentiment dipped to its lowest level in 6 months in May. The people who answered the survey say they're worried that inflation, unemployment, and interest rates may all be moving in the wrong direction. Researchers say the drop was widespread among people of all ages and income groups, although people in the western United States showed the sharpest decline. Higher gasoline prices may have contributed to the souring national mood. Michigan is also shifting from telephone to web-based surveys, which could account for at least a fraction of the decline. The sentiment index is not always a good predictor of consumer spending, which has remained remarkably strong, but it could be a signal of political attitudes in an election year when the economy is likely to be a top issue. Scott Horsley, NPR News, Washington.
The Dow Jones Industrial Average is up more than 100 points at 39,497. It's NPR News.
You're listening to KUOW News. I'm Ruby DeLuna. The Seattle City Council is scheduled to vote on a revised minimum wage law for app delivery drivers later this month. The law took effect only a few months ago that guaranteed workers about $26 an hour. In response, food and other delivery apps imposed fees to cover the increased pay. In turn, fewer customers were placing orders and drivers had less work. Yesterday, a council committee approved a number of amendments that include a new wage of less than $20 an hour and 35 cents for mileage reimbursement. The new proposal does not require the apps to drop the large service charges that many customers have complained about. In other news, summer's still about 40 days away, but it's going to feel like it's already here. We're talking about highs in the low to mid 80s today and tomorrow before things cool down on Sunday. Either way, temperatures will be above the seasonal average highs for this month. And that's telling us something about climate change. Here's state climatologist Nick Bond.
We're starting to talk about these kind of heat events that have occurred in the past. What's going to be one of the more important changes in the climate, the length of seasons is changing rather than just how much the temperatures are changing.
Meanwhile, our snowpack, which is about 50 to 65% of normal, continues to take a hit. And that's setting us for a dry start to the summer, but Bond says the long-term forecast model showed this summer won't be like the scorcher we experienced in 2021, and that's when Seattle experienced a record of 108-degree day. You're listening to KUOW News.
Support for NPR comes from NPR stations. Other contributors include Fisher Investments. Fisher's dedicated team of specialists provide resources on investing, retirement income, estate planning, and more. Learn more at FisherInvestments.com. Investing in securities involves the risk of loss.
Welcome to Friday, and welcome to KUOW's Week in Review. I'm Bill Radke. Washington State parents wonder, is my kid's school about to close? Joining us today are Publicola co-founder and publisher Erica Barnett. Nice to see you again.
Good to see you too.
Did I hear you drop a pen? Do you need another writing tool? I heard something drop.
I can grab it. Oh, hey, you got tons of them.
There we go.
Who said that?
That was me.
Oh, that was Brian Callanan, Seattle Channel host and producer, host of the podcast Seattle News, Views, and Brews.
You got it.
Is that because things come to blows on your show
No.
and there's a swelling?
Oh, I see the homonym there. No,
Okay.
We're trying to refer to coffee breaks.
Oh,
there.
good.
So yeah, check
Good.
it out. I was
Brews.
thinking John Pops. wants a beer over here. Yeah, right. It's about that time.
Who are you? Oh, wait a minute, John Carlson. Yeah, KVI radio host, right?
Yes, when they let in Brian, I snuck in.
You snuck in
the
right
security
behind?
door.
Yeah.
Well, I'm glad to have you back. Welcome.
Good to be here.
Let's talk about. By the way, you can watch us live on YouTube. Just search KUOW, and Brian just waved at you. So let's talk about what happened this week, shall we? Student enrollment is dropping. You probably know. Bellevue decided to shut down Wilburton and Eastgate elementary schools, and they might close more. Olympia is considering it. This week, the Seattle School District said it might close more than a quarter of its elementary schools by next year. KUOW education reporter Sammy West took us to the Seattle School Board meeting where speakers included parent Ben Gittenstein.
To be blunt, this is a bad plan, intended to execute a flawed strategy built on incorrect assumptions, and you, as the school board directors, are the only people with the power to stop it.
And it's important to note, Gittenstein actually ran for school board last election. His campaign was really centered on the idea that we should not close schools, just hard and fast, no. And then there's another camp of parents who don't love the idea of school closures, who does, but they're more so frustrated by what they feel is a lack of engagement, that the district has not properly involved them in these conversations, and they just want to be more part of it.
Okay, so let's talk about this. Lower student enrollment means less funding from the state. Seattle district officials say they plan to discuss possible job cuts with the union. Does anyone here think they'll actually lay people off or cut salaries, or if that's even possible?
Ooh, I know they're talking about cutting some central staff. I'll be interested to see what happens there. But that's what's usually talked about first in something like this. The teachers really are the drivers here in terms of salaries, and that's something that increased in 2022. There was an increased teacher salaries. That's a part of this equation here. I know that nobody wants to talk about closing schools, but this is the financial reality. We've got a school district that's running about $100 million behind every year when it comes to their budget. So,
is it the financial reality, though? Could more money be obtained from the taxpayer instead of school closure? Or is that no way?
I mean, it seems to me, just from reading about this, and I'm not a parent, I'm not a school expert, I should caveat, but I mean, it seems that the McCleary requirement of, funding education
that was a court ruling
at the state level.
At state level, that the state has to fund education is not being met. And so I think that, there is an issue that's more about funding than about, overspending or spending too much on kids, or even keeping these schools open, because from what I understand, closing down the physical schools is not what saves money. As you said, it's laying people off. And so if we start talking about teacher layoffs, I think there's going to be an absolute outcry. At least I would imagine there would be from parents and as well as the teachers union.
See, I think to your point, Erica, I think that the schools are adequately funded by the state. They're spending over $13,000 per student, and then you add in levy money, and then you add in federal funding, and then you add in other fees and whatnot, and you get to just under $23,500 per student. So I don't think the problem is underfunding. I think the problem is under enrollment. And I think the solution is for the Seattle School District not to hire a contractor to do a $100,000 study for them, but to get to the bottom of why so many students are leaving, or why so many parents are pulling their kids out of the Seattle public school system. Well, and it's not just Seattle. I think it's important to point out, you brought up the Bellevue example. This is something that's happening statewide. COVID had a huge impact. Well, I would say the lockdowns had an impact. Okay. And the reason the lockdowns were particularly onerous in Seattle and Bellevue is that while private schools were open in the fall of 2020, the public schools in both those cities and several others remained closed well into the spring of 2021.
These are elementary schools with lower enrollment. I mean, isn't it getting a little late to blame that on pandemic closures?
Well, that's the other thing. I don't think that it's just the pandemic. I think that the Seattle School District is not serving a product that is satisfactory to enough parents, to the point where they're willing to pull their kids out and spend lots of money or invest lots of hours if it's homeschooling, rather than send their kids to the Seattle Public Schools for free?
Well, to be clear, this is not just a Seattle or Bellevue problem or a statewide problem. It is a national problem that is happening basically in every urban school district across the entire country. And so, I don't think we can indict with one broad brush every school district that exists in the United States. I mean, and I think that the data is actually lacking, and this is one issue that parents are bringing up, to suggest that parents are saying, are sort of opting out of public school and into private school because of, the lockdown or any other reason. I think we just don't know. And that is a huge problem. I do think, though, that the thing that happened that has changed the dynamic was the pandemic. And, you're seeing it in high schools, too, with kids just not going to school. And so the impact on kids that we've seen from the pandemic and beyond, and this entire generation of kids, I would say, has been profound. And we don't really understand yet what it's going to mean for schools in the long term. But this is a closing down a quarter of the schools, which would be, I believe, the biggest school closure in the entire country in a decade, is a huge, permanent-ish step in response to a problem that we don't even really understand the reasons for.
Why permanent? You said ish. Why don't you?
Well, I mean, eventually,
if the pendulum swings and enrollment goes up, then.
Well, I mean, I don't know if they're going to keep all these if they're going to keep all these buildings on the books forever. And then, when you want to open a new school, it is quite difficult.
Snap your fingers. And
yeah, I mean, they've been trying to open a downtown school for, basically the entire time I've lived in Seattle. So it's not a simple matter to just undo
but Erica,
that.
As you said, sure, this is a national trend in urban school districts in particular with very powerful teacher unions, but it's worse here. It's more pronounced here. 20 schools, that's more than 1 in 4 elementary schools to close.
But that's not defining the problem. That's you're just describing what the school district has said they want to do to address
solve
a
the
problem.
Right.
But that doesn't mean the problem is worse here than in other school districts.
Well, let me give you an example of one reason why I think a lot of parents are thinking twice about the Seattle Public Schools. I am a product of the Seattle Public Schools, by the way. I'm look how not you a turned public out. school Yeah. basher. West Seattle High, class of 77. And James Madison before that. The Seattle School Board closed down the gifted student program.
This is the highly capable cohort that they're talking about.
Why they have that name, I don't know. But yes, it's the gifted program for schools. I think that education has to encourage and inspire every individual student, regardless of race, class, ethnicity, religion, etc. Every student should be encouraged to reach his or her potential. And they closed the program for highly gifted kids.
The school district says they want teachers to serve the whole range of kids in the classroom, and that can mean kids working independently, teachers and teachers' aides. You got your iPads over here, you got your lectures over here, you got your books over here, and some parents and teachers are skeptical that teachers can pull that off.
It could also mean teaching to the lowest common denominator.
I mean, this was an argument that I remember hearing when I was in elementary school and middle school in the 80s and 90s. And, it is an argument that conservatives have made, across time when gifted programs have existed. I
think it's moms and dads who are complaining about the gifted program.
I think that
not
there's
Republicans versus Democrats.
I think it is. I mean, it is clearly a partisan issue, though, because Republicans tend to support these programs more and Democrats tend to support them less. But my point was not really about partisanship so much as this is an old argument that has existed for a long time. I don't think that, and and schools have gone back and forth on these types of programs. I don't think that is what is causing, again, this mass exodus immediately after the pandemic. I just think that, there is not evidence for the numbers in that argument.
And just to add a little bit more context to this historically, I remember back in 2008, my kids were about to potentially go into kindergarten. My youngest daughter was about to go into kindergarten in West Seattle, and we got the note that was sent out to everybody in our neighborhood. We might be shutting this list of schools down. I mean, that was sent out. It was right in the midst of the financial crisis that was going on at that time. It didn't end up that school did get closed down, but there were a number of them that were shuttered in our neighborhood there that basically stayed shuttered for several years. Have they recently opened? Yes. I just wanted to point out that this is a cyclical thing. I think this is a different cycle. I think this is a different monster we're dealing with in terms of recovering from COVID. And I think that it's going to take a lot more. I hear exactly what you're saying, John, in terms of improving the product. That makes a lot of sense to me. But I do know that this is a here and now problem that has to be solved by this fall. I mean, you can't keep on adding on to this budget deficit, and that's why they're talking about these closures. I'm not in support of them at all, but in terms of what you hear from the superintendent, Brent Jones, about this idea of having a well-resourced school makes a lot of sense. Rather than I just want to bring that up.
Yeah, I'm not to interrupt, but just because listeners might not know all these terms. Yes, the school district is saying that the schools that stay open will be more fully equipped, and they call them well-resourced schools.
Right, so they'd have those counselors there that might help with social and emotional learning. They'd have the extra services there that they would need in those schools so that they're not spread out so thinly. And so I think that's a part of the issue, too. I am thinking about that long-term goal for the Seattle public schools and all of our state schools to improve the product that they have, but there is a here and now component that I'm worried about as well.
Well, when I got out of the schools, West Seattle, it was right before they started the forced busing program, which they didn't have to do. There was no court order. They chose to do it. And by severing the link between neighborhoods and neighborhood schools, a lot of people took a walk, a lot of parents took a walk on the Seattle school district and either moved their kid or enrolled their children in private schools. We are at a point where we're going to replay those days, and those were not good days for the Seattle school district. The forced busing era, the most suicidal thing the school district had ever done, and they finally took almost a generation, but they finally stopped doing it. But
there were pros and cons to the busing program that we don't have time to get into in this segment.
But there's no doubt it test scores for whites went down, test scores for black kids went down. Nobody benefited when you sever the connection between neighborhoods and neighborhood schools.
Well, I think there's
about to do it again.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's an argument that I will not, spend time making, but that people will probably be familiar with, that people did benefit from school integration as opposed to segregation. But, I think that we also should note that not everybody can afford to put their kids in private schools. We're having a conversation about a mass exodus to these very expensive schools, and and we have a school population, that consists of a large percentage of kids. I don't know the exact number off the top of my head, who qualify for free and reduced lunches. Yeah. They are going to be impacted. This is not just rich kids who have the option to opt out of the school system. And I agree with John that this will be disruptive. And I think that is a good argument against it when you're talking about, again, kids, whose lives were dramatically disrupted by the pandemic by not being able to go to school. And then, they're just getting adjusted again, and yanking them out of that school at a young age, because we're talking about elementary schools only right now, seems like a bad idea for that reason.
And just one more piece to throw in there. There are fewer kids that are being born right now. I think that's another piece of this as well.
Yes.
It's happening with the elementary schools. It's happening with the schools all the way up the line, to the point where a number of colleges and universities are concerned about this too. They're projecting in a few years a real cliff in terms of people who are actually enrolling in their schools. Part of it's COVID for sure. And
the expense of living in Seattle's case in particular, just the expense of living in an expensive city. Bellevue could say that too.
Sure. Yeah, there are more dogs than little kids in the city of Seattle.
Yes, that is true. That's been true for a while. More pets, more dogs than kids. Yeah. In Bellevue, the enrollment went down, but private school enrollment, and especially homeschool and these homeschool co-ops, enrollment in those kinds of alternatives went way up.
So homeschooling is easier than it used to be. That you've got this whole online community to help you figure out how to educate your own kids.
So it was less a reduction in kids than a redistribution of kids. And again, we are seeing increasing numbers of people who would rather undergo tuition or the investment of a lot of time in homeschooling rather than send their kids to the public school for free. That is the problem. They're not delivering the product they should for the value involved.
We need to pause there in case you've just tuned in. The Seattle Public Schools there are other districts locally and nationally closing schools, but what a big proposal in Seattle, possibly closing more than a quarter of its elementary schools by fall of 2025. And the process now is that a list of possibly to be closed schools could come out in the next month or so, and then the district has to hold public meetings. I know people always complain about an outcome. Well, they complain about the process when they don't like the outcome. I don't know the specifics on. I think there's a mandated series of hearings and public comment taking. I suppose people maybe don't trust the process. They think you're gonna ask us formally, but you've already made the decision. I don't know about how that goes on behind the scenes, but there will be many public meetings, and then the board will vote on the closures maybe this fall.
And it's going to disrupt everybody's schedule because the reality will change at every school. The closed ones, of course, but also the open ones.
Yeah, right. Before we take a break, this is KUOW's Week in Review. That was John Carlson, Erica Barnett, Brian Callanan. And before we take a break, Erica, Publicola reported this week that some state legislators from Seattle are leaning on the city, is that an okay way to say it, to upzone and densify more than at least the mayor seems to want to. Is the state going to force Seattle to dense up more than we know?
Well, I think right now they're putting pressure on the city. The comprehensive plan is the growth plan for the city for the next 20 years. And the proposal that Mayor Bruce Harrell has put out calls for very, very modest increases in density, less than, even the alternative 5 that most of the city council said they supported. So it's less density than legislators intended when they passed a bill last year to require all cities in the state to accept a certain amount of density in its former single family neighborhoods. And
I thought it allowed for at least that much, and maybe you said 20% more than that minimum amount of growth. Am I getting that wrong?
No, it allows the bare minimum, arguably, of that. So in Seattle, as in every other city, of a certain size, I think it's over 75,000 in the state, you have to allow at least 4 units and up to 6 if 2 are affordable. Seattle has addressed that by basically allowing that, but in a way that will, in practice, only allow very tiny townhouses that have to be very skinny within the same floor plate as a single family house would ordinarily fit. So it's unlikely to produce much housing, and that is part of the problem. So the state, I think there is a question about whether the law as proposed complies with the state law, because for various reasons that are too wonky to get into. But the state law was intended to allow apartments, and Seattle's law effectively does not. And so state legislators, Nicole Macri from the 43rd, Julia Reed, and Noel Frame from the 36th are pushing back pretty hard on that. So we'll see. I mean, I think that there's still room for the comp plan to change, and I think that it probably will before it's ultimately adopted.
And I'm interested not only in the state piece, but what happens at that city level, too, because now it really is in the court of the Seattle City Council to potentially make some changes here. There have been a number of different public meetings over the last several months. I should point out that the deadline for public input here has been extended. It's now up to May 20th. And so contact your local council member if you have some concerns about this, because this is the future of the growth of the city of Seattle. So I'm interested in seeing what the city council does about this, because very recently they pushed back on an affordable housing bill that Councilmember Morales pushed through. So we'll see what they do with the comp plan, because a lot of them had said, we've been listening to community. We've been hearing about adding some more density in these different neighborhoods. Where do we do it? How do we do it in a responsible way? So I'm interested to hear, again, what the state does, but I'm very interested to see what happens on that more granular level, because that's where a lot of this input comes into the city council from the districts. And so it's going to be reliant on the districts and saying what they will to their different council members to see what kind of changes we can make here.
It's interesting when developers used to want to push apartment buildings and townhomes into single-family neighborhoods, they were called greedy developers. And now, if people who live in single-family home neighborhoods resist it, they're the ones who are being called greedy.
Well, what's really interesting, actually, about that is that public opinion has changed quite a bit since, kind of the era that you're talking about. And Seattle
20
Metro...
years ago?
Seattle Metro Chamber of Commerce does a poll every year. And for the last, at least 5 years or so, but it's, gone up every single year. People who live in Seattle say that they want more housing in their neighborhoods, and not just in general in Seattle, but I want more density in my own neighborhood. Consistently, that's gone up and up and up. And one of the things that we pointed out in our coverage at Publicola is that this is a huge shift, that it's true. 20 years ago, 10 years ago, there was a lot of resistance to this idea, but I think people now realize more that there's an affordability crisis in Seattle that is pushing people out, that is pushing people who want to have kids out of Seattle. And that is, that is affecting public opinion, just that awareness.
Can I drop one question on the table? Because Seattle has been densifying for 30 years. Some of us remember the urban village concept, which was the introduction to that.
Yeah, Norm Rice.
We've had decades of densification.
Well, I would argue not really, but...
Well, no, but the trend, though, the trend, Erica, has been in that direction. So do we have a more affordable city to live in?
I mean, I would say that the reason we don't have a more affordable city is that we haven't built enough housing at all. I mean, we have a massive housing deficit right now for the number of people who currently live here or want to live here and are being forced to live in suburbs because we actually, on our podcast Seattle Nice the other week, Sandeep Kaushik, my co-host, was saying, we talk about, oh my God, Seattle is becoming the next San Francisco. We wish we could be San Francisco. San Francisco is massively more dense than Seattle, and no, that doesn't solve the problem on its own. I mean, we have tech workers moving here.
That's the point I'm trying to get to. Can you densify your way to affordability?
I don't think that you can do the opposite, which is what we've been doing, which is concentrating renters, people like me who make up more than half of Seattle now, onto a few busy highways and arterials and saying you can all live in these big, tall buildings, and the rest of us who have, wealth and property will get to live next to parks and amenities because, first of all, that's unfair. And second, the renters are a majority of the population. They need to be allowed to access the 75% of residential land that they've been cut off from, forever, but certainly since the urban village era.
It feels like an issue of supply and demand to me, John. I mean, to get very simple about it, if you've got this amount of people coming in, there needs to be a certain amount of housing built, and also housing built at different levels, meaning affordable to different people. And I'm really interested to see what happens with this comp plan because I've heard that pushback too, and even the numbers that the mayor is talking about trying to hit here are below some of the targets that have been put out there by the city, by the state. And is he going to make it happen with this exact plan? I'm not sure. I feel like there's some relatively big tweaks that could be made here. And again, this is something that's going to play out through the end of the year. We're probably not going to see this new comp plan until the start of next year. There's a lot of different public input coming in right now.
Well, I just want to say on that, to just get to wrap it all the way back around about the state coming in. I mean, those housing targets are not just sort of abstract goals.
Right.
The city has to hit them under the Growth Management Act. And if the city doesn't do that, it does open up, the possibility of a lawsuit saying, the city is committed to doing to doing this amount of housing. And this is not just true of Seattle. This is every single city. And if they don't do it, then that is, grounds for potential legal action in the future. Right. So this is not sort of an abstract commitment. It is real.
Yeah.
John, you've had fewer words, so I'll give you the next and maybe last word before we take a break.
Well, I'm glad that Erica brought up San Francisco because San Francisco does have more density than we do, and it's one of the few cities where housing is less affordable. So I think we should keep an open mind to asking whether or not this solution we're chasing is actually going to deliver the results that are promised, which is more John, densification equals more affordability.
Yeah, I don't think anybody's saying that it's going to make us an affordable city. There's a whole combination of policy changes that advocates are arguing for, including the provision of affordable housing that is, that is specifically affordable and has to be affordable. I don't think anybody is saying you densify and then you live in a magical utopia. I mean, we live in a very small, geographically constrained city, much like San Francisco. That is a factor. But I mean, it's kind of a straw man argument to say, look, Seattle has densified for 20 years and we're not affordable now, so density is a failure. Let's abandon it.
Well, no, I mean
nobody's making that
real
argument.
Real world examples that as Seattle has moved toward more densification, it hasn't meant more affordability. And when you look at cities with much higher density than Seattle, namely the Bay Area, San Francisco, that hasn't resulted in more affordable housing there. So why do we think that it's going to deliver more affordable housing in Seattle?
Let me take a stab at this. We do have to take a break, but I think cause and effect, it's really hard to demonstrate. And I think the simple pushback to that is there is the claim that if Seattle had built even fewer homes than we have, we'd be even less affordable. You can't isolate all the different causes and effects, right? Because there are other reasons besides the housing, the density question that cause prices to rise. So I just think isn't that fair to say? Honestly, it's very hard to point to a cause and effect when you're talking about decades and cities and demographics,
where jobs,
and business
move in.
trends,
Yeah.
where jobs, economies.
And what
right?
kind of jobs?
And
Yeah.
what kind
That's
of
true,
jobs?
too.
Yeah, Amazon, et cetera. We all know what's happened in Seattle. But we're going to pause there, and that's a good conversation. I appreciate that. And we'll have more of that for sure. And in just a moment after we take a break, we're going to talk more about what happened this week and what it means with Erica Barnett, John Carlson, Brian Callanan. I'm Bill Radke. We'll be right back.
It's 94.9 KUOW Seattle. Well, Give Big has come and gone, and you gave big. Thank you for supporting KUOW and NPR. KUOW is a community-funded news organization. Your generosity supports every story we air, every program we air, including this one, Week in Review. KUOW and NPR work every day to keep our community informed and engaged, and your support makes it possible. Thank you. Sunny in Seattle, 73 degrees now. Forecast says we'll get up to 83 today.
Support for KUOW comes from Third Place Books. Timothy Egan launches the paperback edition of his new book, A Fever in the Heartland, The Ku Klux Klan's Plot to Take Over America and the Woman Who Stopped Them. Thursday, June 6th at 7 p.m. Tickets available now at thirdplacebooks.com. And from Finney Ridge Cabinet Company, custom and semi-custom cabinets designed with the goal of making homes functional, beautiful, and livable. Featuring Solera Fine Cabinetry. Learn more at prcabinets.com.
You are listening to KUOW's Week in Review. I'm Bill Radke. I'm with KVI's John Carlson, Seattle Channel's Brian Callanan, and Publicola's Erica Barnett. Hundreds of people seeking asylum in the U.S. have been moving around King County for months now. This week, all or almost all of them cleared out of an encampment in a park near Garfield High School, where some neighbors objected to their mess.
The people in this park cannot wait another week for nonprofits, local and state officials to respond. The park itself cannot suffer the biohazards of human waste, garbage, and lack of sanitation facilities another week.
That's Maisha Barnett, granddaughter of the namesake of the park, Powell Barnett, in the CD. The City of Seattle has agreed to pay for temporary hotel rooms. Now there's some dispute. The Quality Inn Hotel in Kent says it wants a 2-month commitment, but even at best, it's another temporary stay. Is there any better way to handle this situation?
If we knew that answer, I guess we'd have it by now. And I think that's the big part of the issue here, Bill, is that this is not a problem you can kind of take a snapshot in time. This is something that's continuing to grow, meaning we're going to see asylees continue to come into the city of Seattle. We've reported on it. I know it's been reported on this radio station as well in terms of where people are going. They've been coming into the Riverton Park Methodist Church down in Tukwila, which sounds a little amazing to me, but I've been down there and I've talked with Pastor Jan Bullerjack down there and some of the asylees who are there as well. And you wouldn't believe it, but here we are, or here some of these asylum seekers are in Venezuela, in North Africa, and they are hearing through looking on the internet, etc. Oh, Tukwila is where I need to go. I need to fly to Seattle, and so
there's a
they're
Customs and
continuing to come.
Immigration Service office in Tukwila.
That's a good point.
Let me just give a little bit of background to this from KUOW reporter Gustavo Seguro, who told us more about how these folks got here.
These folks are largely from countries in Africa and Latin America. They arrive here through the U.S.-Mexico border where they're met by officials. There they ask for asylum or they declare asylum. From there, they could either get tracked by an ankle monitor or they download an app on their phone which tracks them. They're then given a date to meet with an agent, either remotely in person, to hear about their cases. From there, they bounce around a lot. It's a lot of word of mouth or where to go, but sometimes people stay in Texas, sometimes they're moved out to Denver, sometimes they move out to New York. It just depends on where the shortest lines are and where the most opportunity is for folks.
And as I mentioned, there's this Customs and Immigration Service federal office in Tukwila.
There's a lot of word of mouth. Washington is a really good place for immigrants. Washington kind of positions itself politically as a state that welcomes new arrivals in many different ways.
So this Tukwila church has been one of those welcoming places, and they filled up with hundreds of people. Since then, it's been a mix of money coming from cities, city taxpayers, county taxpayers, nonprofits, individual donors to get people into hotels and short-term rentals.
Right. And the city of Seattle, you remember from a couple of months ago when there was a big shouting match inside City Hall there, the city has tried to make the point that, hey, this is a county issue. This is King County's issue. They should be dealing with this.
But
However,
they're spending money now.
That's what I'm saying. I think there's been enough pressure from these different asylum seekers that the city is responding and giving some money here. It's not necessarily something they put out a press release about, but it is something where that response is definitely happening here. And I worry and I wonder about the long term. When we talk about long term, I've talked with some of these asylum seekers, and they are trying to follow the law as best they can. There's actually a legal clinic that goes on down at Riverton Park Methodist Church. They're talking with them about the different options they have, and they're like, okay, great. I'll sign up for a meeting to see when I can actually have a hearing to be granted asylum. And that's going to be 3 years from now, 4 years from now.
Can I ask you about the legality of that? I want to be clear, maybe help listeners be clear. How is someone from Congo or Venezuela who is seeking asylum here and has interacted with the federal authorities at the Mexican border, how are they different from someone who, say, lives in Mexico, who comes across the border? Is it just, can anyone say, I officially declare asylum, and they're in the same category?
The answer is yes, unless you're from Mexico.
Specifically Mexico?
Yes.
Are there certain countries? So Venezuela and Congo are on lists of countries
Yes.
where the federal...
If you show up at the border and you illegally cross into the United States and you are confronted, though oftentimes they will go out of their way to find a Border Patrol agent or other official, you say, I am seeking asylum. I am a political refugee. At that point, policy currently in this country is that you're going to have your case adjudicated, and they will give you a court date, which is about 3 or 4 years ahead, and they release you into the interior. A few years ago, the policy
with an ankle monitor or some kind of
phone
check-in
phone app. The record on those adjudications are about 9 in 10 are rejected. That the people coming here are just really looking for a better life, and where better than the United States? So that's the first thing. This is kind of a game that is played. The second,
I don't think that. I think that is a somewhat offensive characterization.
No, they're reading. They're reading a script,
playing a game. I mean, I think that they are.
This is a process by which you can skip the line.
It's a process.
And enter the United States. A few years ago, the policy was, if you showed up and said, I'm a political refugee, okay, we'll adjudicate your claim. You must wait in Mexico. Well, the overwhelming majority of the people simply went back home.
Well,
but when that policy was reversed, the doors were basically opened, and we had a flood tide of people not just coming from Central America and South America, but from other continents.
Well, these folks are following the process. They're waiting for their work permits, and they're trying to not be sleeping outside. So where does that leave us now?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I don't want to waste too much time talking about whether refugees and asylum seekers are playing a game by coming here with their families. But I do want to go back to the situation in Seattle, which is, that yes, they are providing hotel rooms through county and city funding. It is only for families, and so what that means is that the people who are remaining in the parks are generally single men, single people. And we don't have a plan for them. The plan that the city has adopted, and I think it's part and parcel of their decision to sort of focus on the beauty and sanctity of the parks, is to treat them exactly the way they treat every other homeless person in the city. And I think that the way that the city treats homeless people now is to sort of sweep them from place to place, declare them to be obstructions if they are in a park, and not provide a lot of shelter for them, and definitely not provide any housing. That is problematic in itself, but when you're talking about asylum seekers and refugees, by and large do not speak English, and putting them, and who come here as part of communities, taking the single men and putting them, in random shelters here and there, shoving them in the navigation center with people, who have long-standing chronic homelessness, that's not meeting their needs.
But what's the realistic alternative, better alternative?
Well, I mean, again, like Brian, I mean, I'm not here to set, a national asylum policy that's way above my pay grade. I don't think that the city should be sweeping them. I think in the immediate term, they should be providing restrooms, sanitation, and sort of saying, I mean, some cities have, designated areas for people to live. I think the city of Seattle is very dug in on this idea that parks have to be, as they put it, held or secured. Yeah. And that is the priority above all. I think that is not a good priority when you're talking about solving this problem.
If asylum seekers don't have a permanent place to stay, or even a very long-term place to stay, does it make sense to, rather than having them be in one spot where neighbors like Maisha Barnett, like you just heard, what have you, are saying this is enough, there's garbage and waste, does it make sense then to move, they're going to be moved around, to move them around from place to place to share that situation?
Well, to be clear, the city has not proposed anything of that sort. That is not even remotely on the table, that they would all be moved, as a group. What the city is doing is declaring them obstructions, giving them information about shelter, telling them to call 211, and telling them that they can get on the very bottom of a housing list that they will never reach the top of. So the city is nowhere near that kind of policy. And I think, again, like if you're complaining about human waste, the solution is restrooms. If you're complaining about trash, the solution is trash pickup. Like, we produce human waste and trash, you and me, in our homes. Yeah. But we have, the ability to have that taken away for us. And we have, indoor plumbing. And so I think these are solvable problems if that is truly the issue. But I mean, I think ultimately, these are just different populations. I mean, the reason they're not, working is because they can't work, because they have to take 6 months to work legally. Yeah. So that is a huge problem that is beyond the scope of local government to do anything about.
Which does that lead into that whole idea that this is not Seattle's problem? And I'm just bringing this up for some context on this, because I think that's what the council is wrestling with, and they're also wrestling with $230 million plus budget deficit they're going into this year with. So I hear what you're saying in terms of providing those services, bathrooms, et cetera, for different people. But I do think it turns into a resources issue for the city of Seattle, and where they prioritize those resources to go. And are we putting these people, that's my whole question, is who goes to the top of the list? Is it this person who's been here for 3 weeks, or wait a minute, this person came here yesterday? How do you do that?
There is no list. I mean,
right,
that's the thing.
That's exactly.
There's no list. I mean, there's a housing list that you can get to the top of by certain criteria that is, that basically has nothing to do with these sweeps. I mean, they're not putting people in housing.
Yeah. John, you've been listening?
Yeah. We've seen around the country, sanctuary cities have become attractive places for people who are in the country illegally, whether they just came across the border or claim to be political refugees, and they're going to keep coming. when they are accommodated the way that this church in Tukwila accommodated them, gave them a place to stay, said, you can stay for this long. When that time came up, and I guess there was
Did
an
the
extension.
church put a limit on the time, or are they
Yes,
just full of?
The church was full, and then I guess there was a respite where they were accommodated. Somebody paid their bills for a hotel for a while,
Mm-hmm.
and then when they were told you'll have to leave, with activists supporting them, they just took over a park and said, we're staying here until someone gives us a place to stay.
I
So
don't
now
know how humans are not supposed to take up space. I mean, they are here. They have to take up space somewhere. They can't evaporate.
So what we have now is kind of an entitlement mentality. I'm here and I need to be housed. That's where we are, and that's where the logic of sanctuary cities will take you.
The whole concept of housing being a human right, I think, is where you're going here, and I feel like that's the issue that's in front of us. And are we going to how are we as a nation, as a state, a county, city, however you want to look at it, how are we going to respond to a humanitarian crisis? I think that Seattle is trying to bring
creating it.
I think that Seattle has declared that it has different values than what you're expressing, John, and that we are a sanctuary city, and that this is a sanctuary state. Now, whether you agree with that or not is your own issue. But
just look at the results. Never mind whether I agree. Just look at the results.
This is what we are.
Yeah.
And so I think that if that is the value of Seattle, it is important for the city to try to live within those values. And I think that, it needs to be something different than, we're just going to declare them an obstruction and clear the park, because that's not a good long-term solution. And it's not a good individual solution for any of these folks that they're sweeping. So, I think that, again, on a micro level, like we need a better policy here in Seattle when dealing with these specific people who do have to take up space because they are here and who we have said we welcome because we're a sanctuary city.
Okay, so we continue to be in the waiting game. We'll keep you posted on the asylum seekers of King County. You're listening to KUOW's Week in Review. We are going to check in on a new approach to overdoses in Seattle and more when we return right after this.
Support for KUOW comes from Town & Country Markets, presenting Food Flight, olive oil tasting with new varieties along with recipes on how to use them. Sample and full-sized bottles of olive oil available. May 11th from noon to 3 at all locations. More at townandcountrymarkets.com.
I'm Julian Marshall, host of BBC NewsHour. On today's programme, Russian forces launch a surprise cross-border attack near the Ukrainian city of Kharkiv. And a warning from scientists that AI has already become a master of lies and deception.
Those stories and a whole lot more this afternoon on BBC NewsHour. It begins at 1 o'clock right after Week in Review on KUOW-FM Seattle, KUOW Tumwater, KQOW Bellingham.
Support for KUOW's car donation program comes from local Kia dealers, presenting the all-electric Kia EV6 with AR windshield head-up display and capable of going 0 to 60 in 4.6 seconds. More info at kia.com.
You are listening to KUOW's Week in Review. Brian Callanan there, Erica Barnett, John Carlson. We're always talking whether the mics are on or off.
True story.
Right on.
Look out. Yeah.
That's a good thing. Let's keep talking. Let's talk about what to do about drug overdoses. This is a running topic on this program. City of Seattle is buying or renting its first space dedicated to overdose recovery. Erica, you were at this announcement. How does this opioid overdose recovery center work?
Yeah, well, it's owned. It's a property that is owned by the Downtown Emergency Service Center, and so it used to be a shelter. And we were there yesterday. There used to be rows and rows of metal bunk beds that are all gone now, and it's this beautiful open space. And at the Morrison Hotel across the street from King County Courthouse. So it's going to be a place where paramedics, fire department officials, the care team from the city, and also, nonprofits.
Erica, before I do want you to finish, I have this image in my head. Are you saying that this is displacing shelter beds?
No.
Oh.
So during the pandemic, DESC, like a lot of other shelters, distributed. They got rid of hyper concentrated congregate shelters and are not going back to that model. And that kind of happened citywide with all the shelter providers to some extent during the pandemic. So this hasn't been a shelter for a while. So they've retrofitted. It's going to be a place where all these providers, including nonprofits that go out and pick people up, off the street and help people or can bring people after they overdose, typically on fentanyl.
Voluntarily, involuntarily?
Voluntarily.
Okay.
Yeah. And right now the way the system works is they either go to Harborview or they just kind of leave them on the sidewalk. And nobody wants to go to the hospital, and so often it's just there's no response after somebody is revived from an overdose. So this would be a 23-hour center where people can come for up to 23 hours and and rest, recuperate, and potentially get inducted onto medication-assisted therapy. Get an injection of a drug called Sublocade, which is a long-acting form of buprenorphine, which basically will help people not use and not overdose in the future. And so it's a really, it's a big step for the city because it's, harm reduction based. It's based on this idea that, we don't just leave people where they are after we've helped them to stay alive. And it can, potentially be a route to additional treatment with Evergreen Treatment Services opening a large campus nearby. So it's part of this continuum of care that is really important. And Daniel Malone, the head of DESC yesterday, did note that what people really need most is shelter, and we don't have that part of it.
Yeah.
But this is an important part of it.
I did want to follow up on that whole voluntary versus involuntary piece because I'm looking at the law of the land right now in the city of Seattle that says public use of drugs is a misdemeanor.
Yeah, what about that?
Right, and how is that going to be enforced, and is this going to turn into a lever to get more people into this treatment center, which is not necessarily a bad thing. I just wonder about that because this is a situation where EMTs from the fire department or police officers could potentially bring someone to this center here. Is this hue and cry that we've had over this public use of drugs, is it actually going to turn into something where we're going to get more people into treatment? Do you have a thought about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that public drug use is a slightly different thing than overdoses.
Fair.
So those
Okay.
are different paths. But I do think that there is an inherent tension between that law and this new overdose
Sarah, Erica,
center.
I'm sorry. I always want an explanation. What do you mean? It's drugs that led to the overdose. So what do you mean
Well,
by
the drug law allows police to arrest people who are using drugs in public or found to be in possession of drugs in public, illegal drugs other than marijuana. And so that is different than paramedics reviving somebody who is overdosed and is lying on the sidewalk and gives them Narcan, for example.
Are they not subject to arrest because they weren't caught in the act of using drugs publicly? Is that
Well, that actually is true. I mean, unless they have drugs on their person, it's not illegal to have drugs inside your system.
Yeah, yeah. Sure.
So, so yeah, that is true. But I think these are thought to be different pathways. But the reason I think there's a tension there is because, you're talking about trust this, uniformed officer from the fire department to take you over to this place where you will go inside and, and it's an institution, even if it's a very, soft and friendly one. And you're also having uniformed officers on the streets who can arrest you and take you to jail, or at least, arrest you. And so there is
arrest you if you are
caught
using public drugs
or in
public.
possession.
Yeah.
Yep.
Right.
And so the question is, you have a policy that this drug law that pushes people deeper underground and deeper into the shadows and causes them to hide so that they won't get caught and arrested. And then you have a policy that says, if you overdose, you are safe. We will help you and we will take you to a place where you will be able to recover. I think there's a tension.
For more than a dozen years, Seattle has been following the harm reduction approach to drugs and overdose. And the result of this approach in the last 2 years has been 2,300 people in King County dead from drug overdose.
That's the result?
Result's
a little
harm
strong, right?
reduction. The harm reduction approach.
I would love to define harm reduction
Yeah,
if anybody would
it's
like to know
it's
what it
the
means.
notion. It's the notion that using drugs is not the harm. It's that you have to use responsibly, and we're going to be very non-judgmental about it. We're not going to have criminal charges, or we're going to have a light touch.
So I will
approach
define
to
harm
it.
reduction as clinicians define it, and as DESC. I mean, this is a harm reduction facility that they're opening. So to be clear, this is specifically a harm reduction based facility because they're not like forcing you into abstinence jail. They are saying, we are meeting you where you're at. So harm reduction is the
We have
idea.
2 minutes left in our program, by the way.
Harm
just so
reduction
you
is
know.
the idea of reducing the harm of using substances so that people are able to recover and don't die.
Or in some cases, continue using. Some harm reduction programs are run by people who are admitted heroin addicts.
Yes,
you think
people are
this
able
is
to
going to
continue
encourage
using.
people
That
to
is correct.
use having this facility, or what's your thought there?
I think it will not encourage them to get better because the leverage that you would need to force an addict into treatment, which is not easy to do. I had a sister who had a terrible drug problem for many years, is missing. The harm reduction approach, 2,300 dead in just the last 2 years, has been a spectacular failure.
Okay. This will be ongoing. This idea of what
Very quickly, though.
causes what and what results in what is very tricky.
I just want to clarify one
Yes.
factual thing. Harm reduction does not say that you have to be forced to stop using, because that is not an approach that works, and that is an approach that has drastically failed in America for decades and decades and decades. So that is the idea, is that no, we don't force people. We try to get them into recovery, which is a spectrum, and I know that very well and wrote a book about it. So, there's a spectrum of recovery that does not require like instant forced abstinence.
I tell you what, we literally got to go. You can't. I know you want to blame me. You can't, because it's a clock.
Good
and
one,
a
Bill.
clock,
Yeah.
you can't make a clock feel bad, feel
Okay.
guilty. But let's keep seeing what happens at this opioid recovery center and keep this discussion going. I've been talking all this hour with John Carlson, radio host at KVI, with Brian Callanan, host and producer at Seattle Channel, and at the podcast Seattle News.
Views and Brews.
And Brews.
You got it.
Erica Barnett co-founded and publishes Publicola. Erica, thank you. Thank you,
you.
everybody.
Happy Mother's Day to all you moms out
Yes,
there.
happy Mother's Day. Thank you to Kevin Kniestedt, who produces this show. Bernard Willett making it sound great, running the board. Hans Twite helping us out, social media and live streaming. Juan Pablo Chiquiza. I'm Bill Radke. We'll see you in a week.